The 2021 fantasy football season is over, but that doesn't mean we at RotoBaller are done analyzing. Baseball is still in a lockout, and the 2022 fantasy football season will be here before you know it, so we're going to keep going. One of the questions that fantasy football managers have to ask themselves is one that was a lot easier in years past. Who should be the number one overall pick on draft day? There are arguably several candidates that we could discuss, but we're going to treat this like a typical award show and get right to the finalists. But first, a little hat tip to some of the honorable mentions. Dalvin Cook, Alvin Kamara, and Davante Adams were good enough to be mentioned here, but not close enough to be finalists. So we'll begin with our 5th place finalist. You should be familiar with his name because he used to be the number one overall pick. It's Christian McCaffrey. Look, I know he burned people the last 2 years, but he played a full 16 games in the 3 seasons before that, and he's only 25 years old, so I'm not ready to write him off just yet. In his 5 full games this season, McCaffrey averaged 20.1 points and half PPR scoring. That put him 0.7 points behind Jonathan Taylor for the number one running back in per game scoring. We know how dynamic McCaffrey is, and he's likely to still be the featured back on the Panthers, even if they reduce his workload a little bit. And now we're going to move to number 4, who could be a little bit of a surprise, because it's not a running back. But if you're playing in anything outside of standard scoring leagues, I think you have to consider Cooper Kupp in this spot. He wasn't just the top scoring fantasy receiver in 2021, he was the number one wide receiver by a significant margin, outscoring Deebo Samuel in half PPR leagues by 67 points and Davante Adams in full PPR leagues by 95 points. Robert Woods will likely miss the start of next season, recovering from his ACL tear, and we have no idea if Odell Beckham will be back in LA. The Rams will get Cam Akers back, but this is a team that wants to throw the ball, and defenses simply couldn't stop Kupp this year, no matter how hard they tried. In half PPR leagues, Kupp only had 2 games this season scoring under 15 points. And there's something to be said for that kind of security at the top of your draft. Before we move on to the top 3, just take a second, click that like button below. It's real simple and easy, but it really helps us to get our content out to more people, and we really do appreciate it. Now, on to number 3. It's the little guy, Austin Eckler. The knock on Eckler heading into 2021 was that he didn't score enough touchdowns. In his first 4 NFL seasons, he hadn't scored more than 3 rushing touchdowns in a single season. But he flipped the script this year, notching 20 total touchdowns, 12 on the ground, and another 8 through the air. Touchdowns are a hard category to predict and not one that should be a determining factor when it comes to projecting fantasy value, but the pros certainly outweigh the cons when it comes to Eckler. He isn't a traditional workhorse back, but there are few of those left in the NFL. He had 276 touches in 2021, which was 8th most in the NFL, despite also missing a game due to injury. He's tied to a strong offense with a young star quarterback in Justin Herbert, so the floor is as high as you can get for a player you could consider with the number one overall pick. If you haven't yet, please hit that subscribe button. You can get all of our off-season fantasy football content, as well as our baseball content when this lockout ends. And now for your number 2 choice for the 2022 number one overall pick, it's Derrick Henry. On one hand, a lot of running backs were getting injured this year, so we shouldn't really hold that against Henry since he should be healthy headed into 2022. On the other hand, a lot of people could claim they saw this coming after 2 consecutive seasons with over 300 touches and 1 season where he got nearly 400 touches. Plus, he started 2021 averaging more touches per game than he had in the season before. Henry seems unlikely to have his workload scaled back, and I'm actually more concerned about him re-injuring himself than McCaffrey, given that Henry's injury was a stress reaction in his foot, and he's obviously going to keep putting a lot of stress on that foot. However, Henry was averaging 24.2 PPR points a game, and that still ranks first among all running backs and second among all players in 2021. The upside to be the top player in fantasy is clear because that's what he was doing up until week 8, so it's hard not to consider that at first overall. Yet, Henry's elevated risk for re-injury makes the top choice a little bit clearer for us, and that means Jonathan Taylor comes in as our number 1 option for the 2022 number 1 overall pick. He was Mr. Consistent in 2021, not falling below 50 rushing yards once all season and gaining over 100 yards on the ground 7 of the last 9 weeks. Then there are the 20 touchdowns, buoyed by a league-high 83 red zone attempts. As you mentioned with Eckler, we can't always rely on touchdown consistency, but Taylor does have insanely high usage rates in the red zone. He plays behind one of the best offensive lines in the game with a run-first mentality backed by a solid defense. Taylor got slightly more involved in the passing game this season and is a linchpin of this offense and fantasy teams in 2021. We mentioned with Henry that high usage rates can be a sign for concern with injury, but Taylor's only in his second season and clearly seems to be ascending, making him a strong choice as the number 1 overall pick in 2022. Thanks for rocking with us all season here at RotoBaller. Again, make sure to click that subscribe button to get all our 2022 fantasy football off-season content. Enjoy the playoffs.